What was going on in the studio, though, was a real tug of war going down to Mexico to shoot Catch-22. But like a lot of movies, it just ran over.
Two 11-year-old boys from Queens discovered they could harmonize perfectly. 50 years later, they weren't speaking. The world thought it was about fame, ego, or artistic differences. But the real story? It's darker than anyone imagined. Picture this: Paul Simon, hunched over a recording console, systematically erasing his partner's voice from their comeback album. Track by track, note by note, until Art Garfunkel had been completely wiped from existence. But this act of betrayal wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the latest wound in a friendship that had been bleeding for decades. What makes their story even more tragic is that they had everything: talent, success, millions of adoring fans, and a musical legacy that would outlast them both. Yet underneath it all was a psychological battle that began when they were children and escalated into a decades-long war of resentment, jealousy, and wounded egos that would ultimately destroy one of music's most beloved partnerships. The Golden Beginning. In 1953, 11-year-old Paul Simon sat mesmerized in the audience of PS 164's fourth grade talent show. On stage, a boy with an angelic voice was singing, Art Garfunkel. They lived just blocks apart in their Jewish neighborhood in Forest Hills, Queens, but it would take 2 more years before they truly connected during a 6th grade production of Alice in Wonderland. Paul played the White Rabbit, Art the Cheshire Cat. Art later recalled thinking Paul was the most interesting kid he'd ever met. Funny, smart, magnetic. The neighborhood they grew up in was typical of 1950s middle-class Jewish families. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, and parents who valued education and hard work. Paul's father, Louis, was a musician who played bass in dance bands, while his mother, Belle, was an elementary school teacher. Art's father, Jacob, was a traveling salesman, and his mother, Rose, was a homemaker. Both families encouraged their sons' musical interests, but neither could have predicted what was coming. Music became their obsession. They'd spend countless hours by the radio, absorbing every note of the rock and roll revolution happening around them. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and the Everly Brothers were their heroes. They'd practice harmonies in Paul's basement or Art's bedroom, figuring out how their voices could weave together into something beautiful. Paul's voice was good, clear and steady, but Art's had that ethereal quality that made people stop and listen. Soon they formed a street corner group called the Peptons with some friends, but the real magic happened when it was just the two of them. They'd perform at local events, school assemblies, and even on street corners in Manhattan, passing the hat for spare change. Even then, people noticed Art's voice more than Paul's songwriting, a dynamic that would define and eventually destroy their partnership. By 1957, at just 15, they scraped together $25 for studio time at Sanders Recording Studio in Manhattan. They recorded Hey Schoolgirl and Lightning Struck. Music promoter Sid Prazin heard them by chance and convinced their parents to let him sign the boys to big records. Calling themselves Tom and Jerry, they watched their song climb the Billboard charts, selling over 100,000 copies and earning them a spot on American Bandstand. The experience of appearing on American Bandstand was surreal for two teenagers from Queens. Host Dick Clark introduced them as the newest sensation, and they lip-synced their hit while trying to look casual. But even in that moment of triumph, cracks were showing. Paul had written the song, but it was Art's voice that the audience responded to most enthusiastically. The pattern was already being established. For two teenagers from Queens, they were living the dream. But dreams, as they would learn, can quickly turn into nightmares. Their sudden taste of fame also brought pressure from the record label, from their families, and from each other. They were still just kids trying to figure out who they were, and now they had to do it under the spotlight. The first Betrayal success faded as quickly as it had come. Their follow-up singles flopped, and by 1958, both were heading to college. Paul to study English at Queens College, Art to pursue architecture at Columbia University before switching to art history. They were still technically Tom and Jerry on big records, with Art using the stage name Tom Graff and Paul calling himself Jerry Landis. But something was about to shatter their partnership. In secret, Paul recorded a solo single under the fake name True Taylor. True or False was released without a word to his supposed partner. When Art discovered the deception, he felt gutted. This wasn't just about music, it was about trust, loyalty, everything their friendship had meant. Paul later claimed he did it because he was hungry for success and didn't want to wait around, but Art saw it as a fundamental betrayal of their partnership. What made it worse was that Paul had been the one to suggest they stay together as Tom and Jerry while pursuing their education. Art had trusted him completely, believing they were partners in everything. The discovery that Paul had been secretly recording behind his back felt like a knife in the back. Even decades later, the memory haunted both men. Paul would later admit the pain in Art's eyes still hurt him, especially when he remembered Art once saying with cruel precision, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." That comment, seemingly innocent, would echo through their entire relationship. 5 years of silence passed, but in 1963, the folk music revolution was sweeping America, and both young men felt its pull. Artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Pete Seeger were using music to speak truth to power, addressing civil rights, war, and social injustice. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a movement. They began performing quietly in Greenwich Village clubs like Gerd's Folk City and the Gaslight Cafe, using the names Kane and Gar, testing whether the magic was still there. The Village was the epicenter of the folk revival, filled with coffee houses where young artists could perform for passionate audiences, hungry for authentic, meaningful music. It was. Producer Tom Wilson, who was also working with Bob Dylan's transition from folk to rock, spotted them and knew he'd found something special. Wilson was one of the few African-American producers in the industry and had an ear for artists who could bridge different musical worlds. He got them an audition where they performed The Sound of Silence, a haunting song Paul had written in his bathroom with the lights off and water running, chasing the perfect acoustic environment for inspiration. The song itself was Paul's meditation on alienation and disconnection in modern society. The bathroom acoustics with the water running created a cocoon-like environment that matched the song's introspective mood. It was typical of Paul's perfectionism. He would go to any length to get the exact sound he was hearing in his head. They signed with Columbia Records under their real names, but their timing seemed cursed. Their first album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., released in October 1964, was a disaster. Only 3,000 copies sold. The Beatles and British Invasion had made folk music feel ancient overnight. Crushed, Paul fled to England to rebuild as a solo artist while Art returned to Columbia to study mathematics. It appeared to be over, again. Then fate intervened in the strangest way. In spring 1965, college radio stations in Boston and Florida started playing The Sound of Silence. Tom Wilson noticed and made a decision that would change everything. He remixed their folk song, adding electric guitars, bass, and drums without asking the duo. Paul was performing in Denmark when he learned their song was climbing the charts. When he finally heard Wilson's remix, he was horrified. It sounded messy, awkward. But America disagreed. The song hit #1 on January 1st, 1966, after 14 weeks on the Billboard Top 100. Suddenly, Simon and Garfunkel were famous, and they were trapped together again. Their third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, released in October 1966, was a masterpiece that stayed on the charts for nearly 3 years and sold over 3 million copies. Using 8-track recording for the first time, they achieved a crystalline sound that showcased their harmonies perfectly. But success bred new problems. Scarborough Fair, adapted from an ancient English folk song Paul had learned from Martin Carthy, was credited only to Simon and Garfunkel. Bruce Woodley of the Seekers co-wrote Cloudy, but received payment without credit. These decisions would haunt them later. Their performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 proved their staying power. While Hendrix smashed guitars and The Who created chaos, Simon and Garfunkel's gentle, thoughtful sound reminded audiences why folk music mattered. Some critics called them unhip, but their performance proved they belonged. Then came The Graduate. Director Mike Nichols had a revolutionary idea. Instead of a traditional soundtrack, he wanted to use Simon and Garfunkel's existing songs. Paul agreed to write 3 new tracks, but touring interfered. Instead, the film editor used The Sound of Silence and Scarborough Fair while cutting scenes. The music fit so perfectly they kept it. The soundtrack became a cultural phenomenon, competing with the Beatles on the charts. Mrs. Robinson, the one new song Paul wrote for the film, won Record of the Year. The movie gave them a broader, older audience, while their music provided the film's emotional foundation. Cracks in the foundation. Behind the success, resentment was growing like poison. Paul wrote every song, made every creative decision, led every recording session. Art primarily sang and offered feedback from the control room. The imbalance was obvious to both men, and it was eating them alive. Paul later confessed his jealousy when crowds erupted for Art's vocals on songs like Bridge Over Troubled Water. His bitter thought was always the same. I wrote that song, yet it's Art getting the applause. This frustration traced back to childhood. Paul's mother had once told him, "You have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice." That simple sentence had carved a wound that never healed. Art had his own struggles. He admitted that Paul was in the way for a large part of my life. He wanted to write songs too, but felt overshadowed, never even attempting to contribute because he didn't think his work could measure up to Paul's. For decades, he remained silent about his own ambitions. In January 1969, everything changed. Both men had been cast in Mike Nichols' film Catch-22, but Paul's role was suddenly cut from the script. Art went to film in Mexico while Paul remained alone in New York, hurt and abandoned. Director Charles Grodin later called this the moment their partnership began to fall apart. You don't take Simon and Garfunkel and drop one of their roles. You just don't do that. When they finally talked, Art explained his plan. 6 months of filming, then back to recording. Paul's response was definitive. Actually, no. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that. Art's 6-week shoot stretched into months. Paul tried to work on their album Bridge Over Troubled Water long distance, but it was impossible. Songs were sent back and forth, notes exchanged, but the magic was gone. Paul finished parts of the album without Art. On some tracks, Art barely appears, on others, not at all. One song, The Only Living Boy in New York, became Paul's goodbye letter, referencing their old stage names. Tom, get your plane right on time. I know your part'll go fine. Fly down to Mexico. The song captured Paul's loneliness and how far apart they'd grown. When they performed Bridge Over Troubled Water live, the same painful dynamic played out every time. Art's soaring vocals brought crowds to their feet in thunderous applause, while Paul stood beside him thinking, I wrote that song. In the 2024 documentary In Restless Dreams, Paul speaks honestly about these moments. He'd given Art the lead vocal because he believed Art's choir-like voice was perfect for it. Still, it hurt. People celebrated the voice they heard, not the person who created the music and lyrics. Art later revealed his own pain, admitting he'd partly befriended Paul out of pity for his height as children, offering love and friendship as compensation. Then he added something chilling. That compensation gesture has created a monster. Summer 1970, Forest Hill Stadium, Queens. 2 nights of polished, professional performances that felt strangely distant. There was little talking between songs, no warmth or jokes. After the second night, they simply said goodbye. No dramatic fight, no public announcement, just a quiet, personal farewell. Paul later shared, "With Artie, there was no reason to talk about it. It just ended. That sentence alone reveals how completely their communication had broken down. Paul threw himself into his solo career with fierce determination. Albums like Paul Simon, There Goes Riemann Simon, and Still Crazy After All These Years proved he didn't need a partner. Songs like Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard and 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover became massive hits. His 1986 album Graceland was revolutionary, blending South African music with his songwriting and selling millions while winning multiple Grammys. Art struggled more. His voice remained beautiful, but his solo albums never matched their collaborative heights. Ironically, his acting career flourished. He received critical acclaim in both Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge, with critics calling him a natural actor. Paul later admitted feeling bitter about the attention Art received, quoted as saying everyone praised Artie's talent, feeling, and looks. The frustration was palpable. The person he'd made music with was now being celebrated for something entirely different. In 1975, they briefly reunited for My Little Town, recording it separately for their individual albums. The song reached number 9, but the collaboration felt cold, mechanical. Paul even admitted he wrote it with a darker tone, telling Art he was singing too many sweet songs. Their 1981 Central Park concert drew over 500,000 people, one of the biggest concerts in U.S. history. They performed 21 songs as the New York sky darkened, and fans were ecstatic. But behind the scenes, they weren't speaking to each other. Even with the cheers and applause, their personal problems remained unchanged. The most devastating chapter came in 1983. After their Central Park success, they began recording a new album called Think Too Much. Art carefully recorded his vocal parts, but Paul grew impatient with the process. Then, without warning, Paul called Art and told him he was removing his vocals from the album. An engineer confirmed that every trace of Art's voice was systematically erased from the master tapes. When the album was released that November, it came out as Paul Simon's solo project, Hearts and Bones. Art's voice survived only on bootlegs shared among hardcore fans. The betrayal cut deeper than any previous wound. By 1993, their attempts to perform together collapsed entirely. A critic's review referring to Art as merely one of many collaborators ignited their fury. The backstage tension became so intense it turned physical. Paul's business manager later said he feared someone might get stabbed if a knife had been nearby. There were reports of shoving and yelling, with crew members worried the violence might spill onto the stage. Two men in their 50s, still fighting the same battles they'd been waging since childhood. The height difference that Art had teased about as children became symbolic of everything wrong between them. Paul underwent years of therapy, and his insecurity about being short was a constant focus. Art's childhood comment, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you," never stopped hurting. Despite everything, Paul still called Art his oldest friend in recent interviews. But by 2016, his patience was gone. "We don't get along. It's not fun." When their 2010 farewell tour was canceled due to Art's vocal problems, Paul took it as the final betrayal. "He let us all down. I didn't feel I could trust him anymore." So, what really ended Simon and Garfunkel's friendship? It wasn't one moment, one betrayal, one argument. It was the slow poison of resentment, jealousy, and unequal partnership. It was childhood wounds that never healed, success that amplified every insecurity, and two brilliant artists who could create beautiful music together but could never figure out how to simply be friends. Paul once said, "Duos don't stay together," comparing their split to Lennon and McCartney, the Everly Brothers. And when duos reunite, it's not about the music, it's about the business. In the end, their story is one of brilliance, beauty, and bitterness. Two boys from Queens changed music history but couldn't outrun the pain that came with growing up together and growing apart. Their harmonies were perfect, but their friendship never could be.